Picture this. Margaret sits quietly in the corner of the nursing home common room, her weathered hands folded in her lap as younger residents share tales of their glory days. When she mentions flying combat missions over Korea, the room erupts in skeptical laughter. "Come on, Margaret," someone scoffs. "Women weren't even allowed in combat back then." She simply smiles, reaches into her worn handbag and lets a purple heart medal tumble onto the coffee table. The room falls dead silent as they realize they're in the presence of a forgotten hero whose classified missions remained buried for 70 years. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Sunset Manor's common room, casting long shadows across the worn carpet where a dozen elderly residents had gathered for their weekly storytelling circle. At 92, Margaret Chen sat in her usual spot by the window, her silver hair neatly pinned back and her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized armchair. She listened patiently as Harold, a former factory foreman, regaled the group with yet another tale of his supposed heroics during the Korean War, a story that grew more embellished with each telling. When Harold finished his dramatic account of single-handedly holding off enemy forces, the room buzzed with polite applause. Margaret shifted in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had heard similar stories countless times over the years, tales of valor and courage that, while perhaps exaggerated, came from a place of genuine pride and longing for recognition. The facilitator, a young volunteer named Sarah, turned to Margaret with an encouraging nod. "Would you like to share something from your past, Mrs. Chen?" Margaret's voice was soft but steady as she began to speak. "I was stationed in Korea too during the war. I flew reconnaissance missions over enemy territory, gathering intelligence for the ground forces." The room grew quiet, but not with the respectful attention Harold had received. Instead, there was an uncomfortable shifting in chairs, sideways glances exchanged between residents. Margaret continued, undeterred. "My aircraft was a modified P-51 Mustang, stripped of most armaments to carry camera equipment and additional fuel tanks. We flew low and fast, often behind enemy lines." Betty, a former schoolteacher with a sharp tongue, couldn't contain herself any longer. "Oh, Margaret, really now? We all know women weren't allowed in combat roles during Korea. You might have been a nurse or worked in communications, but flying combat missions?" She shook her head dismissively. "Let's stick to stories that are at least believable." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, and Margaret felt the familiar sting of disbelief that had followed her for decades. Harold leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying a condescending tone. "Listen, sweetheart, I respect your service, but let's not get carried away here. The military was strictly segregated by gender back then. Women stayed safely behind the lines, doing important work, sure, but nothing like what you're describing." The other residents nodded along, some looking almost embarrassed for Margaret's apparent delusion. Even Sarah, the young volunteer, wore an uncomfortable expression, clearly unsure how to handle what seemed like an elderly woman's confused memories. Margaret sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the skepticism and patronizing dismissal that had become all too familiar throughout her life. She had grown accustomed to people questioning her stories, chalking them up to age-related confusion or a desperate desire for attention. For 70 years, she had carried the weight of her classified service alone, unable to share the truth even with her own family. The official records had been sealed, her unit's existence denied, and her heroic actions buried beneath layers of government secrecy and Cold War politics. But something was different today. Perhaps it was the way Harold had smirked when he called her sweetheart, or maybe it was the pitying looks from the other residents who thought she was simply a confused old woman living in fantasy. Whatever the reason, Margaret felt a surge of quiet determination rise within her chest. She reached slowly into her worn leather handbag, her fingers finding the small velvet box she had carried for decades, a box containing the one piece of evidence that could validate everything she had just shared. The room had moved on, with Sarah trying to restore order by asking another resident about their experiences. But Margaret's movement caught Harold's attention, and he watched with curious amusement as she withdrew something from her bag. "What's that you've got there, Margaret? Another war story prop?" His joke drew chuckles from several residents, but the laughter died instantly when Margaret opened the small box and let its contents spill onto the coffee table with a soft metallic clink. The purple heart medal gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its distinctive purple ribbon and bronze heart-shaped medallion unmistakable to everyone in the room. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft tick of the wall clock, and the distant sound of traffic outside. Haro. LD's smug expression vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Betty's hand flew to her mouth, and even Sarah leaned forward to get a better look at the metal that had just shattered everyone's assumptions about the quiet woman they thought they knew. Margaret's weathered fingers traced the edges of the Purple Heart as she began to speak, her voice carrying a strength that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. This medal was awarded to me on December 15, 1952, by Colonel James Morrison of the 18th Fighter Bomber Wing. I was shot down over North Korean territory while photographing enemy supply lines near the Chosin Reservoir. The residents sat transfixed, their earlier skepticism replaced by rapt attention and growing shame at their dismissive treatment of this decorated veteran. The story that unfolded was unlike anything they had expected to hear. Margaret had been recruited in 1951 as part of a highly classified program that trained select female pilots for dangerous reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. The program, codenamed Operation Nightingale, was born out of desperate necessity. The military needed pilots who could fly undetected through enemy territory, and women pilots, being unexpected, often went unnoticed by enemy forces who weren't looking for female combatants. I had been flying since I was 16, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. My father owned a crop dusting business in California, and I could handle any aircraft they put me in. When the recruiter approached me in 1951, he said my country needed pilots who could blend in, who could fly missions that officially never happened. She paused, looking directly at Harold, whose face had gone pale. There were 12 of us in the program. Only 7 survived the war. Margaret's most dangerous mission came in November 1952, when she was tasked with photographing a suspected enemy weapons depot hidden in the mountains north of Seoul. Flying alone in her modified P-51, she had successfully completed her photographic run when enemy fighters appeared out of nowhere. 3 MiG-15s came at me from different directions, she recalled, her eyes distant with memory. I managed to evade the first 2, but the third one got lucky. His cannon shells tore through my left wing and shrapnel hit my shoulder and leg. With her aircraft severely damaged and losing altitude rapidly, Margaret had faced an impossible choice: attempt to make it back to friendly territory or crash land in enemy-controlled mountains. She chose to fight for every mile, nursing her crippled Mustang through mountain passes while bleeding from her injuries. I made it to within 2 miles of our lines before the engine finally gave out, she said quietly. I crash-landed in a rice paddy, and American ground forces reached me before the North Koreans could. The photographs Margaret had risked her life to obtain revealed a massive enemy ammunition depot that was subsequently destroyed by B-29 bombers, potentially saving countless American lives. But because Operation Nightingale was classified at the highest levels, Margaret's heroism remained hidden from history. She was quietly awarded the Purple Heart and several other commendations, but officially, her unit never existed, and her service record was sealed. For 70 years, I've carried this secret, Margaret said, carefully placing the Purple Heart back in its box. My own children don't know the full truth about what I did in Korea. The government finally declassified some of our records in 2019, but by then, most people who might have cared were already gone. She looked around the room at faces filled with awe and regret. I didn't share this story to boast or seek attention. I shared it because sometimes the truth needs to be told, even when it's uncomfortable or hard to believe. Betty was the first to break the profound silence that followed. Tears streaming down her cheeks, she moved from her chair to kneel beside Margaret. I am so sorry, she whispered, taking the elderly veteran's hands in hers. We had no right to dismiss your service. You're a hero, and we treated you terribly. One by one, the other residents approached Margaret, each offering their own apologies and expressing their amazement at her courage and sacrifice. Harold, humbled and visibly emotional, shook Margaret's hand with trembling fingers. Ma'am, I owe you an apology and my deepest respect. What you did for our country. He paused, struggling to find adequate words. Thank you for your service. And thank you for finally sharing your story with us. Margaret's revelation transformed not only how her fellow residents saw her, but how they understood the hidden sacrifices made by countless unnamed heroes throughout American history. Her story reminds us that heroism often wears humble faces and that the most extraordinary acts of courage frequently remain buried in classified files and forgotten memories. The women and men who served in secret operations, whose valor was never publicly recognized, deserve our acknowledgement and gratitude. In a world quick to doubt and dismiss, Margaret's Purple Heart serves as a powerful reminder that truth often surpasses fiction, and that real heroes walk among us every day, carrying their stories quietly until the moment comes to share them. These forgotten warriors fought not for glory or recognition, but for duty, honor, and love of country. If Margaret's story of hidden heroism and long overdue recognition moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of military service and sacrifice. Hit that notification bell to never miss tales of the brave men and women who served in silence, whose courage deserves to finally be heard. Their stories matter, their service matters, and their legacy lives on through each person willing to listen and remember,